February the 1st, 1959 at Belleville, CNR Roundhouse, 6167 and 6243 sitting on the ready track. This was one of the final strongholds of steam up to the end of steam operation on CNR in southern Ontario. At the eastern end of Belleville CNR Yard, northern 6245 and 6246 were exchanging places on an eastbound extra freight for Montreal.
John, I don't know how many people are familiar with the fact that in the following year, when we began operating steam excursions on CN with 6167, in fact, we had a choice of 2 locomotives we could have used in steam excursion service. One was 6167, of course. The other was 6245, and I believe it shows up as one of the engines in this sequence at Belleville. We chose 6167 for the excursion engine, and subsequently became quite famous over the ensuing 5 years or so, because it simply looked better than 6245. That's our opinion. I wonder if it's shared by the viewers here.
Oh, I'm sure it is. Both of them were good-looking engines, though, to a true CNR fan. And you're quite correct. 6245, you'll see in a moment.
I think this is it right here.
Correct, coming off and heading back to the shop. And it's certainly ironical that on this particular day we had 6167 and 6245 at the same location in regular operation.
There it is. And I guess when we didn't pick that locomotive for excursion service, that was the kiss of death, because it was scrapped shortly thereafter.
In any event, here we have 6246 departing for Montreal in grand style at the head end of a 60-car freight train, and it was a sight that was not to last for very long. Saturday, February the 21st, we're at Sunnyside Station, down on the platform, watching the Maple Leaf arrive in from Niagara Falls and New York behind a 6200 Northern, a scene that was so familiar for so many years, and of course now even the station is gone.
The station, the platforms, the footbridge from which this picture was taken.
And these transfers of freight back and forth from Immoco Yard to Bathurst Street. And this is a Mike backing up, doing the transfer work. And maybe, Jim, you'd like to say a few things about that early version of TOFC.
Well, not much to say. It certainly was about 40 years before what we see now. But if you simply look at the trains that were passing there, the trailers on flats were about the only thing that survived to this day.
Later the same morning, we were out at the east end of Immoco Yard, CN 6112, a Northern, I think, which was a transplant from the Maritimes at the end of steam, is backing on to a freight headed for Montreal. Tommy McElrath was with me on this occasion, and not to be too excited, we didn't realize that hidden behind 6112 was the eastbound counterpart of the 4-City Limited, Train 82, behind one of those speedy 5700 series Hudsons.
It's curious when you look at that train passing that spot now. It's you can replicate it today with GO Transit.
Here we are further down the line, hustling out of Sunnyside Station for the last mile and a bit into Union Station. Note the empty Gardner Expressway. Further west out in the heart of Mississauga at Dixie Road Level Crossing, and that was one of my favorite photographing points, we have an inbound CN passenger train making good time behind one of those beautiful thoroughbred 6200s.
I suppose it's the heart of Mississauga now, John. It certainly wasn't then. Here's the Dixie Road level crossing, which is now a grade separation surrounded by high-rise apartments.
Again, later in the same day, out at Bronte Station, 6482 running light to Hamilton.
The station was moved in the early 70s from this location up to Milton, where it was going to be part of the Ontario rail preservation effort.
We moved further along to Bayview Junction, still one of the most popular places for railway photographers today. We're at the west end of the junction, and this is Train 83, the express local, on its way to London, getting a roll on its ascent up Dundas Hill.
I guess, John, this is one of the trains that used to run into Hamilton, then back out to Bayview, and then make this run up the hill, wasn't it?
You're absolutely correct. There were very few that didn't do that, one of them, of course, being the Forest City. We're now over at the east end of the junction, watching a freight work its way out of Hamilton Yard and up the hill towards Burlington.
I guess that technically is Hamilton Junction. The interesting point there is the use of a diesel helper, and I guess this was really the beginning of the end. There's your old car, John.
You're right, it's the handwriting on the wall, just like that yard switcher behind the CP mic that's backing out of Hamilton Junction with an odd movement towards Waterdown.
P line up to Waterdown, John, now, of course, sees a tremendous amount of freight traffic between Hamilton and Guelph Junction.
At the same spot, we have a CN freight which has descended Dundas Hill from London, entering into Hamilton Yard. We then moved over to Burlington, and as you can see, snow was everywhere. This is a snow clearing job moving off the Hamilton and Northwestern line to Allendale. And probably, Jim, as you pointed to me earlier, that diesel locomotive is perhaps still in existence today.
A terrific number of them still are.
But note some of the features around here. We're looking at the Branch Street Level Crossing Tower. There's a gem for you. And 6185 is struggling out of the siding after having taken water, and you can see that wonderful water tank in the background, headed off towards Bayview Junction and eventually up the hill to London.
Most of the locomotives we've been seeing here have been products of Montreal Locomotive Works, at least on the CN side. But this particular group of Northerns were built in Kingston by the Canadian Locomotive Company. They had distinctive diamond builder's plates that were mounted on the smokebox front below the running board.
Let's listen to 6185 as she tries to get a grip on her freight train and head off to Bayview Junction.
John, you'll probably recall back in the early days of 1959 when the afternoon passenger train to Montreal headed down in sections. This particular day was third number 6 with 6206, and steam at that time was a rare occurrence.
6206 has had a long struggle up the hill from Danforth with the Ottawa section. Jim, I'm down on the ground with my movie camera and weighing the distance on top of that boxcar on the right-hand side. I think I can pick you out, ready and waiting with your camera.
Well, indeed so, and when I turn to take my going shot, coming up shortly here, you'll see a long, lanky guy standing down there with a tripod and his movie camera, and that was you, and I guess that was the time we first met. And in this shot of mine just now, you see the engine approaching the station.
Good Friday morning, March the 27th, at the west end of Toronto's Union Station, CN and CP Power backing onto the various westbound passenger trains, one departing for London and Windsor on CN, and CP 2857 was backing on for the train to Hamilton and New York City.
It's interesting to see these kerosene flames being used to clear out the switches at the west end of Union Station. The Toronto Terminals Railway continued to clear switches that way until just about 10 years ago.
2857 was the first to leave with the morning train for Hamilton, Buffalo, and New York City. Here seen passing the relatively new Ulco passenger diesels, which were heading up train 21 for London and Windsor.
These Buffalo trains were always interesting. They had Canadian Pacific cars from the Toronto, Hamilton, and Buffalo Railway, and of course the through cars for the New York Central.
Dixie Road level crossing later the same day. 2857 coming back to Toronto. Really got a good roll on quite a collection of coaches and head end cars, which was supposedly a local train from Hamilton. Later on Good Friday afternoon, on the CN's Oakville subdivision, just west of the Canadian National Exhibition Grounds in Toronto, I was photographing for the very last time CN steam power in general service.
I think we all had that experience, John, on Easter weekend that year. I was on my way back from Stratford behind CN 6214. Little did I know that would be my last experience with regular service CN steam.
Jim, I think we were all in shock with respect to the sudden disappearance of CN steam on Easter Monday. Fortunately, there were still pockets of CP steam running into the later months of 1959. We're in Trenton on Saturday, May the 9th. I'm on my way to Belleville for a CRHA fan trip when, much to my delight, I found 280-3507 carrying out a regular switching assignment in the Trenton yard.
You know, it's quite incredible to think that with the number of locomotives still active on CP, probably down to a couple of dozen, that an ancient old 280 like this with inside valves could be still found in 1959 shuffling cars at a division point, a fairly extensive division point like Trenton. And I guess the irony too is that nowadays trains barely slow down at Trenton. There's nothing left of the facilities there. No switching, no yard engine, no 3507, just a main line.
Sunday, May the 10th, Belleville's CN station, and for a while it looked like it was just a regular passenger extra, but this in fact is the CRHA spring excursion behind CN Mogul 90 and Consolidation 2649, which ran to Bancroft and returned that day. The first run past was at the Moira River Bridge near Foxborough.
I guess, John, you were on board that day, weren't you?
I was indeed. It was our humble duty to run the lunch counter car for this excursion. It was one of the fine examples of cooperation between the Upper Canada Railway Society and the Canadian Railway Historical Association. However, I always found time to get off at the run past, or most of them, and leave the duties for serving the ravenous crowd to others.
I think the ravenous crowd was out taking pictures anyway.
We're curving off the Campbellford sub here at Madoc Junction onto the line from Trenton that ran north to Bancroft, our eventual destination. I think this is, if I remember correctly, was the Maynooth subdivision.
This is part of this vast network of rail lines that we used to be blessed with in southern Ontario, which is gone to the scrap dealers. The train is gone, the line is gone, and in some cases it's hard to find remnants of the right-of-way.
A little further up the line, our first run past, a fine display put on by the engine crews who cooperated fully all day long. It was really a photographer's delight.
These excursions, of course, depended on a huge amount of planning by the trip organizers, the volunteers who were there on the day of the trip to look after the stepping boxes, making sure that people got on and off, the people who went ahead to scout the run-past sites. Like every endeavor, the smoothness of the operation on the day that it runs is a direct reflection of the amount of planning and organization that went into it before the day of the operation.
Well, you should know, Jim, you had first-hand knowledge in all the trips that you organized for the Upper Canada Railway Society. Number 90 with a real roll on a run past just north of Ormsby Junction. And then into Bancroft for servicing and fueling. Coe Hill Junction. If you can find it today, it'll be amazing. But it's probably one of the finest spots for photography because you can sit on the steps of the maintenance of way shack and just watch that train come right at you.
And of course, if the smoke inspector was around, the crew would be cited for violations.
Note old Mr. Cole, one of the favorite excursionists of the CRHA, waving his hat. He was on many trips. Our next stop was at Marmora Station for watering, and then we were on for the final run past across the Moira River Bridge, again in the twilight, just outside of Belleville.
Bridges were always a favorite target for the excursion organizer because we knew that everyone who got off the train to take pictures could line up along the bank and consequently take good pictures of the train without having other photographers in the way. When you didn't have a bridge to work with, it became quite a different story altogether.
Well, our love with sea and steam carried on, and the next excursion I attended was with Ed Jordan and was outside of Detroit. On Sunday, June the 14th, we left Detroit behind a big Mikado, number 3752, which took us up to Pontiac. As you can see from the picture, the consist included open gondola cars. The aim of this trip was to travel a branch line from Pontiac to Jackson, Michigan, behind two Class J3A light Pacifics, 5038 and 5043.
I don't profess to have a lot of knowledge of the Grand Trunk Western operations, John, but I think these were similar to locomotives that were used in Canada. They always looked a little different because of the placement of their headlights and number boards.
I would have to say that those safety standards and rules that you talked about a little earlier, Jim, were very relaxed on this trip. We're near Wixom, Michigan, and at that point, a number of us were either allowed or tolerated to climb onto the tender of the second engine. And we're accelerating over the Chesapeake and Ohio Diamond, and it was an interesting ride, although I'd have to say that I was thoroughly doused with cinders.
I guess you get an example of those safety violations right here. I think probably for everyone of our generation, the things we did when we were younger are things that we wouldn't tolerate others doing today. And this is certainly one of those things.
Well, you're certainly correct. All I can say is that the crew, I think, demonstrated some good sense. There was no fast movement, and although it looks dangerous, everybody was in a secure position, other than in this particular shot. We certainly all, though, had a very enjoyable afternoon. The weather was fine. The locomotives were in clean shape, were operating satisfactorily, and it was my farewell to Grand Trunk Steam.
But it sure made for strange pictures.
It certainly did. Some of the structures along the way were of particular interest to me. You can see in the background here a station with the conical hat tower. Some of the Grand Trunk Western stations on branch lines had some very interesting features. The run pasts were not particularly spectacular. They were more like crawl pasts, and that was partly because of the number of people hanging around the locomotive. We're all back on board the train and departing for Jackson. You'll get another view of that wonderful station structure that I was just talking about as we leave this particular point. Many of the excursionists stayed in the open gondola cars all afternoon long, and you can see them rolling through the countryside. It was my first experience of riding in that kind of equipment, and later in the afternoon, as we can see, I spent some time out there photographing and having a very enjoyable time talking with some of the riders back there. All the way along, though, we always seem to have people clinging to the tenders of the two locomotives. We're in Jackson, a wonderful typical scene of taking on water. They then turned the locomotives on the turntable and reversed their order for the trip back to Pontiac. The locomotives have been wiped down by the engine crew at Milwaukee Junction in Detroit and were fine examples of well-maintained, from an external point of view, at any rate, steam locomotives. And then back to one of those outposts of CP steam. Jim, it's Thursday, July the 2nd, 1959, and I'm in downtown Orillia, and CP Mikado 5102 is doing a little bit of switching.
Boy, times have sure changed in Orillia. Of course, now in the last years of the 20th century, there's no railway track in Orillia.
It's hard to believe that both railway lines have both railway companies and their tracks have disappeared. This is Lake Couchiching in the background. The locomotive was at the end of its way freight run from Port McNicoll. You can see it passing here one of those wonderful CPR enclosed water tanks.
Yeah, John, the enclosed water tank, which is in behind the train, we'll see it in a minute. Certainly the enclosure wasn't needed on this day, but it provided a means for the railway to keep the tank warm by means of a small heater inside the enclosure, keeping things from freezing in the cold winter months.
We're partway back to Medonte. One of the wonderful features of this wind-up camera is that at the right moment,
you run out of wind and the scene stops like this.
Later on in the fall, September the 17th, I was back to Port McNicoll, and 3422 was the engine in use that day. We're departing the Port McNicoll yard, running over the short connecting track to the CN line that ran from Orillia to Midland. CP used to travel over this regularly to service the grain elevators at Midland, and particularly a locality over there called Tiffin. The engine crew on this particular day were most cooperative and quite funny in some of their actions, as we'll see. They were most amused by my behavior. I think they liked the idea that perhaps they might be showing up in Hollywood on film. Far from it, but it was a lot of fun. I'm about to receive a face full of smoke and cinders, it's an overhead bridge just before the Martyr Shrine. The engineer understood that I would be up there from our previous conversation, and they started to lay on a little bit of smoke. And then, as you'll see, he wanted to make sure that I was going to be right in the line of fire. We're now at the west side of the harbor in Midland, and about an hour's worth of switching was taking place. Some of the lifting of cars of grain from the elevator taxed all the ability of 3422. She's not the most sturdy animal for this kind of work, but at the same time, the crew seemed to feel very much at home with the way she operated.
I guess it's worth noting that 3422 is almost an identical twin of the 3507 we saw at Trenton a little earlier in this film. An ancient locomotive which just by chance happened to be one of the last survivors.
For a little added tractive effort, the firemen would get out the broom and paddle. We're in front of the CN station. 4519 is the CN representative, and of course, steam has long disappeared. July 19th, National Railway Historical Society, Buffalo chapter, and their famous triple double-header fan trip up to Guelph Junction and over to Streetsville and up to Orangeville. We're leaving Hamilton Junction, headed for the Waterdown Hill. And let's listen to the recording by Cliff Redans in the baggage car. Two Mikes, 5118 and 5214, after their struggle up to Guelph Junction, had an easier time coming down through the hill at Campbellville, through Milton, and here we are passing the famous Hornby Dip in Hornby Station. At Streetsville, the two Mikes were dropped in favor of two D10 10-wheelers, 1098 and 1092, and they're backing around the west leg of the Y to pick up their train on the main line and then head up to Orangeville. That's not a forest fire that we see, Jim. We're approaching the forks of the Credit Station, probably one of the most popular photographic spots on this line.
This is the point at which the line encounters and traverses the Niagara Escarpment, and we're fortunate that several years later, in fact in the 70s, we were able to replicate this sort of train as Ontario Rail ran trips between Toronto and Orangeville and Owen Sound over this same line.
And just above the forks was Cataract Hill. That's what we just heard coming up with our train. It was a real struggle, as we can see here. We're north of Orangeville on our way to Fraxa. The crew had cut off all the passenger cars, and we're running the two locomotives and the baggage car up to Fraxa to be turned on the Y.
I see people on the tender.
And in the baggage car. I guess the rules were also relaxed this day, certainly for this small portion of the trip. We're back in Orangeville, and the locomotives, we were busy remarshaling the train for the southbound trip. We're near Melville in full cry. Approaching Inglewood, passing the enclosed octagonal-shaped water tank just before crossing the CNR line from Hamilton to Allendale.
the fact that this line, the CN line, was here, John, gave rise to a Union Station in Inglewood. There it is, with a CP train order signal on the CP side, and out of sight of the camera on the left side of the picture is a CN train order signal on the CN side of the station.
I must admit, Jim, I never ever transferred trains in Inglewood, although I've been through Inglewood on both railway lines. There was a short stop for picking up orders or at least checking with the station agent, and then we were out of town with great gusto. Pacific's 2214 and 2332 had replaced the two 10-wheelers back at Streetsville and had come charging up Campbellville Hill, as we saw and heard in the last scene. We're now at Guelph Junction, and the train was being switched over from the north or westbound track to the eastbound track in preparation for heading off down the line to Waterdown and back down to Hamilton Junction.
And so you've seen 3 pairs of locomotives on a single excursion. This has to be the most costly in terms of locomotive resources excursion that I've seen in recent memory. And I guess 40 years ago doesn't really class as recent memory.
Well, it certainly was an extravagant day or extravaganza, and the crowd and the excursionists certainly got their money's worth. We're now just pulling past the water stand and easing off down the line to Waterdown. Daylight was fading. I think I was certainly tired. We'd been on the road all day long. But Jim, the NRHS Buffalo chapter, or Niagara Frontier chapter as they're known today, has to be congratulated for a wonderful outing. We move on to more CPR steam in excursion service. It's Saturday, October the 3rd. We're departing from the CPR Windsor station in Montreal, charging up the hill to Westmount. Inbound is a set of RDC cars. And of course, it was the RDC cars plus a handful of diesels that replaced all the steam engines on the CPR commuter traffic in Montreal. We're coming around the curve from Montreal west, headed toward the Adirondack Junction. 424 was on its way to Farnham for our first major stop of the day. And at this point, we're approaching South Junction Tower.
South Junction was a mechanical interlocker with its own interlocking tower, and not too long after this train passed by, it burned down. Well, it didn't burn down, but it was gutted by fire, and Omer Lavalley and I dropped by there several days later, and the tower was literally still warm. Took a few pictures, and it was a completely dismal sight.
We're crossing the St. Lawrence River and approaching the new double or twin lift bridge for the double-track Adirondack subdivision over the St. Lawrence Seaway. It's a massive structure and certainly dwarfs the little 424. Our first stop was at Adirondack Junction Station, where we had an opportunity for a still photograph. And then we proceeded on to Farnham. Upon arrival at Farnham Station, as seen in this picture, everyone disembarked while they uncoupled the 424 and ran it up into the yard. 946, a larger D10 brother to D4, was back down, followed by the 424 to form our double header. Then we were off to St. Guillaume, both engines putting on quite a sprightly performance. At St. Guillaume, we had to back around the Y, in preparation for heading back to Farnham. At St. Rosalie, we had an opportunity to take further pictures when the engines were serviced, and particularly 424, which was in the company of CN Diesel 1711, a Montreal Locomotive Works product that was used at that time on a commuter train running on the CN out of Montreal. Here's our first run past, Jim, and as you can see, the crew spared no effort to make lots of smoke.
It's almost too bad because as I recall, that train was entirely comprised of wooden equipment, and the smoke successfully obscures most of it.
The final run past of the day was just north of Farnham in the setting sun, crossing part of a branch of the Richelieu River. Back at Farnham, the 946 was uncoupled and both engines were run over to the shop area for watering and servicing, and then the 946 was put to bed in the engine house, and 424 carried us back to Montreal, and of course was the big star in the next day's trip. On Sunday, October the 4th, Jim, 424 took much of the same consist up the north shore of the Ottawa River through Montebello and on to Ottawa. Here we are coming around the curve by Park Avenue Station, and you can see the 424 is in good shape, giving us a good start to our day's operation.
I remember that trip well, John. It was a gorgeous fall day. It didn't look as if it was starting too auspiciously here, but the colors were resplendent. The locomotive was in fine fettle. The wooden train consist was superb, and it's difficult to know how it could have been improved upon.
Well, I agree with you. Even the scenery was of the first order. Here we are crossing the Rouge River on the first run past of the day. Again, the crew made every attempt to give us maximum smoke and lots of sound and noise. I think you might remember this location, Jim. You have a fine black and white photograph taken, if I'm not mistaken, from the other side. We're just south of Montebello.
Yeah, there were a number of good pictures taken that day by a great number of enthusiasts. It was particularly pleasing in some of the small Quebec towns to enjoy the tranquility of a Sunday morning with nothing but church bells, and then along comes the train.
Our third run past of the day was at the Little Nation or Petite Nation River Bridge. I always got a large amount of amusement out of the photographers plastered on the rock cut here as the engine roared by. You also get a good view of the wooden equipment, followed by that unique wooden business car on the end.
Number 1. I think this business car was assigned at the time to the superintendent at Park Avenue. It was much shorter than the conventional car, and it indeed carried the number 1.
We're at Buckingham Junction, where we stopped for water. The crew posed in front of the engine, and that's the black and white picture you saw earlier in this sequence, and then off to Hull. After crossing the interprovincial bridge over the Ottawa River, we then crawled around the short, sharp turn that leads into the tunnel underneath the Chateau Laurier Hotel, but not before we get a glimpse at the Parliament buildings.
Kind of interesting here, John. You're on the train. I was up at the Parliament buildings taking a picture of the same train crossing the bridge and approaching Ottawa.
While Union Station 424 was cut off and run back over to Ottawa West for servicing, here she is disappearing underneath Confederation Square.
As 1959 wound down, our jungle telegraph was becoming quite efficient, and occasionally CP would turn a steam locomotive out on the train to Hamilton, and in November, this is what happened.
Sunday, November the 15th, to be exact, Jim. That was 2857 on its early morning run from Hamilton back to Toronto. Here we see her backing up after being refueled over the ash pit, and then she'd be backed into the roundhouse to wait for another call. Whether that would ever come or not was hard to say. A week later, in Montreal, the CRHA ran a final excursion for the 1959 season using one of the rare CP440s, number 144. This engine, as we all know from our experience with 136 up on the South Simcoe Railway, is a magnificent beast. Collects a lot of cinders in the smoke box, as we just saw from the grin. Has a headlight that brings you back probably 80 years, and of course fits in very nicely with the old tradition of oiling around. The weather was not very good that day, but nonetheless, run pasts were held, and the first one of the day was across the Ottawa River, leaving Montreal Island on our way to Vaudreuil.
This train operated, I believe, down to Cornwall, didn't it, John?
It did, and with its three-car consist of wooden equipment, there were times on the Cornwall branch when you could open your eyes and think that you were really back around the turn of the century on branch line railroading. We stopped in Vaudreuil for orders and a still photography opportunity, and then it was off to the branch line down to Cornwall. On the way down to Cornwall, we had two run pasts. And upon arrival in Cornwall, the train was broken up and the combine car and the engine were turned on the turntable at the Cornwall engine shed. 144, I think, had the highest drivers, Jim, if I remember correctly, of the 3440s, and was quite a high stepper in her day.
I beg to differ. I think you'll find 29 with its 70-inch drivers was probably the speediest.
See, even 40 years later, it's never too late to learn and be educated, is it, Jim? 144 is heading down the lead to the turntable in order to be turned around. Quite a crowd had gathered around the turntable. Many of the citizens of Cornwall had turned out to watch this amazing scene. I guess it wasn't a regular everyday occurrence for 144 to show up in Cornwall, certainly not at this stage in the 1950s. Jim, once again, you get a good view of that grin on the smoke box door.
Yeah, that's, I think, John, the result of working the engine a little too hard, and of course there was an accumulation of hot embers drawn forward into the smoke box. Here you see the somewhat dirty task of removing that material so that the engine can carry on. We looked at this with a little amusement on this day, but found ourselves doing exactly the same thing a decade later when we were operating engine 136 on excursions between Toronto and Orangeville.
Take a good look at this wonderful mechanical coaling facility. Not the cleanest operation in the world.
But it beats shoveling.
And now it's December the 29th. Montreal West in a howling blizzard at the crack of dawn. Jim, if you remember correctly, you joined myself and Ed Jordan in traveling to Montreal to take in the last of regular CPR steam operation. Here's the morning commuter from St. Therese arriving behind a G3 and blasting off towards Westmount.
Through that winter of 59 and 60, when I think it's fair to say CP steam had its last hurrah, I don't think I've ever been so cold. I think a number of us made a number of pilgrimages down to Montreal during that period, and every time it was absolutely perishing.
Here's another G3 departing with the local from Vaudreuil, and I can only echo your comments about the cold. In fact, I often think today if I had to go and do it all over again, would I really stand out there in that freezing snow and wind? A little later, it's a little brighter, and we have a streamlined Hudson on a morning train from Rigaud. And take a good look at the engine, Jim. If I'm not mistaken, they've already removed the crowns, signifying it as a Royal Hudson.
If it's the 2820, I think you're right, and I'm not sure who they was, but I think some Philistine probably helped themselves to a souvenir ahead of time.
The rest of this day found us thawing out in the St. Luke engine house, if I remember correctly, but the next morning we were back at it early in the day, but not so bright, to watch the inbound commuter traffic at Westmount Station. The traffic here is quite congested. You have inbound commuter trains, and once they've unloaded at Windsor Station, they back up the hill past Westmount Station to the turning loop. Here we see the inbound Atlantic Limited passing an outbound backing up commuter train, and it would be followed by more commuter trains and the overnight train from Toronto. Later the next morning, we were back at Montreal West Station to watch CP Royal Hudson 2825 leave with the second section of Train 154, the Frontenac for Quebec City. The first section was the regular operating RDC cars. Because of the heavy holiday traffic, 2825 was required to pull a very hefty second section.
Anybody who operated those locomotives, John, swore that they were the finest steam locomotives that CPR ever rostered.
Back at Westmount Station, being New Year's Eve, there was a special commuter operation that left at noontime. I had the good fortune to ride in the cab of 2426 from Windsor Station up to Westmount, and then ran like the devil down the platform to try and be in a position to watch her depart for Montreal West and then on to Vaudreuil.
2426 was one of those relatively small group of locomotives in that class that had a Worthington feedwater heater.
In the meantime, over in the Glenyard Roundhouse, the Roundhouse crew and hostlers were busy preparing engines for the afternoon commuter rush. A number of engines would be run into the engine house for servicing during the day, such as 1224. And Jim, take a look at the engine wipers still at work on the neighboring engine to the left.
There was a class act that seemed to prevail at the Glen, and virtually every locomotive that was turned out there was just polished highly. This quality of service survived virtually until the end.
Later in the day, 2426 had returned from Vaudreuil and was turned on the table and also entered the engine house. I think, though, it was probably being parked for New Year's weekend, and my feeling is it saw very little service after this particular operation.
Of course, John, Glenyard was the passenger depot in Montreal for CP, and with the disappearance of intercity passenger traffic, of course, its role diminished substantially. It continued to serve the Montreal commuter operations operated on behalf of STCUM for many years, and that service was continued to be based at the Glen. But in more recent years, even that has diminished, and the property, once a hive of activity, as we can see from these pictures, is virtually vacated.
That's hard to believe when you look at the lineup of engines here and the bustling activity, as you have noted. I find that in the march of time, so much changes that it's virtually unbelievable when we look back to see a scene such as this. The afternoon lineup of engines are being stationed under the coaling tower, and here we have 1258 being fueled and serviced, followed by CP Mike 5175, shown here on the turntable. Now you might wonder why a Mike is being serviced with all the passenger locomotives. Well, Jim, I had the good fortune later that evening on New Year's Eve to ride the last double-headed ski train into the Laurentian Mountains on the CPR. And of course, at the head end were 5175 and 1258 with a long rake of old wooden coaches filled with skiers, their skis, and much of their beer.
What an experience that would have been.
It certainly was. It was a grand way to exit 1959. Jim, we're about to see, entering from the right-hand side, one of the most venerable institutions of Glen Yard, 3642.
Ah, dear friend. And speaking of that dear friend, the late Omer Lavalley said to me one time that 3642 was a fixture at Glen Yard. It had always been a fixture at Glen Yard. It would always be a fixture at Glen Yard. And when it ceased to be, the world would come to an end. The locomotive is no longer a fixture at Glen Yard, but then I suppose Glen Yard doesn't exist either. So
he's
I
partially
guess,
right.
In a sense, Omer was right.
He's partially right. The rest of the world is a lot poorer for not having either Glen Yard or 3642.
Or Omer Lavalley.
Jim, I think the afternoon switching crew actually preferred the 3642.
I would have.
It seemed to me that there was an Ulco yard switcher parked over by the turntable, but here we see 3642 busily switching cars in preparation for evening train departures. The first was the Atlantic, limited to St. John, New Brunswick, and we see her pushing some of the sleeping cars together, and that was followed by the makeup of Train 21, the overnight train to Toronto.
It's interesting to reflect on the fact that all of this switching of passenger cars was accomplished in the traditional way by hand signals between the ground crew and the engineman. No benefit of radios, the sort of thing that we take for granted today.
Jim, my final memory of the Glen, with all its activity, is depicted as shown in this picture. And one by one, the engines that were lined up back down to Windsor Station for their late afternoon and early evening departures.
It's fitting, isn't it, that this Royal Hudson is center stage for that moment.
And note the high standard of cleanliness. We see the setting sun glinting off the smoke box as she cracks open the throttle just a little bit and starts down the hill. Let's listen one more time.